Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Stacy Weber. I'm an instructor with Pragmatic Marketing, and I'd like to welcome you to today's installment of the Pragmatic Live series. Today, we're here to talk about humanizing marketing with buyer personas. Now, many of you may be familiar with Pragmatic Marketing already. We specialize in training companies in how to become truly market-driven. So we look at techniques for listening to the market, gathering market facts, and then using those facts to drive our strategic planning decisions, and also using them to drive all of the execution activities. Now, one of the techniques that we focus on in our training is the use of buyer personas, studying the market and creating personas to represent the buyers, and then using those to enable understanding across the organization. And I'm very happy today to have with us an expert, a global authority in this area. I'd like to welcome Tony Zambito. Tony, it's really good to have you here, and I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you very much, Stacy. It's just an absolute pleasure to be here today, and we're going to have a wonderful, fun conversation about how to humanize marketing and hopefully offer some good perspectives on what buyer personas are and how to use them to humanize your marketing. And by way of introduction here, I was reflecting earlier today, in fact. It was about, I would say about 13 years ago that Alan Cooper and I had a conversation with Pragmatic Marketing and went over the concept of user personas and buyer personas. So here we are 13 years later, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. So buyer personas basically got started through human-centered and user-centered design movement in the mid-'90s to the late '90s in Silicon Valley and through Cooper Design. And what I did was basically then took many of the persona concepts to create something unique around the concept of buyer persona specifically for sales and marketing. And it's been a great ride ever since. Have done well over 1,000 buyer interviews and have been able to help some leading companies. And so what I hope to do today is just share about the evolution of personas and how they can be used to humanize your marketing. What we'd like to do first, it's always good to know the audience, and that's part of the reasons why we do buyer personas. So what I would like you to do is if you could give me a sense about yourselves, in terms of your job title or your level, that would really help out too as well, and hopefully I can be able to address certain aspects of each particular title, if you will. So I see some results are coming in as we speak, which is fantastic, and thank you for sharing. It's really appreciate it. So at this point, it looks like we have a majority in the management role, which is fantastic. And so what we'll talk about today is how to be able to use the influence, if you will, of buyer personas and how to lead with buyer personas as well. So let's move on. It's great to see this. The number one marketing challenge today is connecting with buyers. And I think that many of you in your daily roles, your daily life, in fact, if you will, this is a challenge you probably wake up with every day, is how do we put some programs into place? How do we connect with buyers? And it's not getting easier because we're in the midst of a digital age revolution, if you will. And buyers today obviously are behaving differently than 10 years ago. They have more tools available to them. There's obviously the use of digital technology that has changed the way buyers interact. So for many of us today in marketing, this is the supreme challenge we're faced with, and that is how to connect with buyers today. What I want to introduce to you today is this concept, and this is the concept of what is the human story behind your product. Behind every product, behind every service, behind anything someone does, if you will, with a product or service, there is a story. And in your role, buyer personas and just the idea of a story is something that you can aspire to. How do I uncover the human story that's taken place behind my product and service, which is going to give me a deeper understanding of how I can help customers and buyers and how to actually speak to customers and buyers in a way that's helpful. So having said that about the product, one way we can begin to understand that is if we can find out the human story of your buyer. And many of us that are in B2B, for example, we have a way of being rational. We have a way of objectifying, if you will, the product, and we speak in terms of objects. And what we're finding out today, what is much more powerful, is to understand the human story that's filled with emotions and drama with our buyers. And if we can understand their story, then we can have a better sense of how to communicate and how to help. And here's the issue that we're dealing with today. In my thousands of buyer interviews, one of the things that I often hear about is people are tired of corporate and product speak. So it drones on, and we find a lot of commonality among competitors saying the same thing, but doesn't have any relevancy to what people are doing and what their human story is all about. So in essence, this is a problem. This is a dilemma that we have to solve. How do we get out of corporate and product speak and really do connect on a human level with customers and buyers that really means something to them? So let's take this next poll question, if you will. If you are using buyer personas, it would be great to get a sense of how effective you think they are at the moment. So the results are coming in. So we're getting about 90 to 100 responses so far, with the majority in the slightly effective and the not effective column. Well, let's say between somewhat effective, slightly effective, and not effective are the majority of the answers. So that's very revealing. I'm not surprised by that in many ways. So what I hope that we can accomplish today is how do you make that next step? How do you take buyer persona to a level that they truly are effective? And hopefully when we do this poll question down the road again, let's say, for example, you can answer with truthfulness that if they are effective and very effective. So thank you for sharing your responses. One thing, let's take a look at buyer personas. Buyer personas are an element of a human-centered approach. So when I say that, one mistake that's often made is to view buyer personas as a standalone type of process or practice. In reality, buyer personas are really part of a more holistic human-centered approach that began with the human-centered design initiative back in the mid-90s. And what I mean by that, buyer personas is not really a profiling exercise per se. It's about how do I discover the human interest in people? How do I then, once I'm able to discover that, how do I understand it? How do I begin to really make sense of it? How do I synthesize that? And last but not least, then how do we model something with it? What is it telling us to do with this information that really then connects and puts us at the center of the human story? And so one concept I just want to throw out there, a generalized principle, is that buyer personas are really not a standalone type of practice. What they really are is an element of a complete, holistic, human-centered approach toward marketing. So let's take a look at this. We've had a number of responses there that went from somewhat effective to not effective at all. And really, when you think about it, good buyer personas tell a human story. And what you want your buyer persona to tell is the story about what is happening behind your product and service what is happening in the world of your buyers? And how did that inform how you communicate? How do you develop a product marketing strategy? How do you develop a content marketing strategy that actually connects with the entire holistic human story of your buyers today? So I love this picture because what this picture embodies to me is, here's a person that's in the midst of an adventure. And sometimes it can be rough, it can be great, it can be exciting, and it can be dangerous. And when you look at your buyers today, they are filled with emotion and they are filled with stories when they are in their day in the life with their companies, their organizations, and in today's world, even when they're working virtually. But a lot of things can happen that are filled with the intangible, the emotional side of the world they live in. And so I mentioned earlier, what we really want to do is how do we get beyond just the rational or the objectified way that we talk to buyers to really understand the human emotions that go behind products and services today. Goals are at the heart of buyer personas. And this is a very, very important principle that I hope everyone could get. And one of the things that I'm beginning to see lately is that people are beginning to say buyer personas should include goals. And I think that's great. However, what I'd like to caution you on is the way that's being described is that goals are probably just, the word goal is just being swished out with the word objective. And that's not the point that we want to get at. And later on, I'll have a slide that's about goal-directed behavior. So in essence, what we're looking for, we are looking for the goals of buyers today that actually influence their behavior and how they make decisions and how they make choices, which is very different than an objective. An objective is a statement, where goals, in this sense, in the buyer persona sense, and in personas in general, is to really look at their goal-directed behavior and how that's influencing how they do things daily, how they make choices, and ultimately how they make decisions. So it's a very, very important concept. So throughout this conversation today, I will be really honing in on the concept of goals. Buyer personas help us understand the human story then behind goals. It's an important concept. Once we get to understand goal-directed behavior, the behavior that's actually causing someone to want to accomplish their particular goal and how they act out with it, there is a human story that goes with that. And the more you can understand that story of why a goal is important and why they behave the way they do in trying to accomplish that goal, the closer you are going to be in connecting with that particular person and that buyer. It's a very important concept for personas as well as humanizing marketing today. So here's a definition of buyer personas in many ways in terms of how to use buyer personas. You really want to keep human goals at the center of marketing. This is really the essence of why buyer personas go hand in hand with how to humanize marketing. Because once you can get to the human story, the goal-directed behavior of people, and you can put that at the center of marketing, then you are really zeroing in on a lot of different things other than just the rational logic behind a product or service. You are really zeroing in on why is something so important for this person and this buyer. What is it that's driving them to accomplish this particular goal? And what are they doing to try to accomplish that goal? And then how do we fit in? How can we fit in to really help that person? So with buyer personas, they're basically an archetypical representation of real people. And what I mean by that, real people means that there has to be a way that we have conversations with real people along the way, and they then inform what our buyer personas look like. They should be a representation of real people. And archetypical is a good word because in the world of social sciences, the concept of archetypes are used all the time. So it's a very important concept that goes hand in hand with buyer personas. And then I'm going to repeat again, it's a representation of their goals, and then it's a representation of the human story behind their goals. So I would like, as we move on today, to give you a sense of this. This is changes the way we might look at buyer personas in general. So, for example, if we have a person named Jenna Thompson, we want to understand her human story. And there are certain components of buyer personas that really help shape an understanding of the human story. So we've got, what are the goals? Again, what are the goal-directed behaviors associated with Jenna? Can we have a sense of the experiences that Jenna goes through? Do we understand mental models? Meaning mental models are the mindset, an aggregate of a person's attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions that shape, in this case, Jenna's view of how she thinks the world works. And then we have context scenarios. And what I mean by that is that Jenna is going to behave differently depending on the scenario. So I'm going to talk about scenarios in a little while and how that's so different than having a generic view of the buyer's journey. So I want to talk about human insights. Human insights are extremely important in order to humanize, and it makes sense, human insights and humanize. And oftentimes, we can get hung up on exactly what is an insight, excuse me, and we're looking for things that are sometimes factual, sometimes intelligence-based, or rational, when we really need to look at more the human story type of insights in order to humanize. So let me have another poll question here. How effective is your organization at including, let's just say there's a little misspec there, including human emotions in your marketing efforts? Let's take a quick poll on that. So we're rapidly approaching 100. And once again, we're probably, with the majority of the responses, in slightly effective to not effective at all. And so hopefully by the time we get through this conversation today, we can have some ideas for you to act upon. And how do you build human emotions into your marketing effort? So thank you for those that responded. There's about 121. I think we got about 150 plus on this, so don't be afraid to answer that question. But we're going to move on and hopefully have some good ideas to share about how to include human emotions into your marketing effort today. So one concept I want to talk about today in general is to know the difference between intelligence versus insight. And the word insight has become very popular in business in general and marketing and sales. Oftentimes, though, one of the mistakes that I've seen quite a bit is calling actually a business intelligence or a buyer intelligence actually insight. So I want to talk about this so that each of you can then be led to a point where you can get the insights you need to humanize your marketing. So what we want to distinguish here is extremely important. You want to distinguish between a buyer profile intelligence versus buyer persona insight. And this is a very important distinction. And what I see a lot, particularly in remedial situations I get involved in with organizations, I've seen buyer personas that I've been asked to review, and I see the majority of the buyer personas that were completed are filled with intelligence. There's really no clear insight. involved. And so one of the things that I hope that we can share is what really is a good insight, for example, and what's the difference between intelligence and insight. But I want to lay this out for you because it's really important that that distinction be made. So let me give you an example. I often see in remedial situations, or I see in the blogosphere, I see in articles, something about buying criteria insight. Buying criteria is intelligence. It's not a human-centered insight. So there's many other different types of things that we can call it, intelligence versus insight. But I'm using this as an example. Oftentimes, sales organizations, this is something they're after. At one point in time in my career, I was the vice president of sales back in the 80s and the 90s. So obviously, one of the things that we spent a lot of time on was trying to uncover the buying criteria. And this is a very common practice you'll find in sales organizations, is to uncover that. So I raise this as a point because it's a matter of sales intelligence, but what is the human story behind that? Really not a lot behind the in terms of getting the human story behind that piece of intelligence. So let's take a look at this, for example. Oftentimes, we'll have a buyer profile. And the buyer profile, in sales in particular, will have things about the buying criteria. We'll have a listing of the common strategic initiative in an industry or for the type of buyer. There's a lot of work that goes into sales training and sales enablement around how to handle objections and barriers and et cetera. And then there's also a lot of information about the KPIs of customers and the ROIs and the success factors. Well, here's the thing. This is all sales intelligence. And the problem with this is that if you want to humanize your marketing, it's very difficult to humanize your marketing around sales intelligence. Now, I'm not discounting that you should not, or that you should use it. Obviously, this is a very important component. But I want to make clear that buyer profiling in this way has been done for the last 3 or 4 decades. And buyer personas are designed to really drive the human-centered approach and to really understand the human story of people. So how do you humanize your insight gathering then? Let's take a look at this. Emotions are the largest factor in decisions. I want to start here. Oftentimes, some of the biggest decisions involve a lot of emotion. So a big decision doesn't necessarily have to be a high dollar amount, by the way. So it's easy to go there and say, if somebody is going to make a $1.5 billion purchase decision, well, yes, there's a lot of emotions that could go into that decision. But those same type of emotions could be there for somebody who might have to make a decision around $15,000. But what we want to find out is what are those emotions? What is the human story that's going on in that person that's leading up to that decision? And that's where you can make the connection with buyers on a human level. Here's a surprising fact that backs this up. Greater than 65% of executives rely on subjective insight and emotion when making decisions. This came out of a recent Fortune Knowledge Group study of 720 senior executives. So if we're only focused in on the rational, the logical, the objective, we're missing out on a big piece of how executives today make decisions. So this is a very important concept to understand. So when I go back and I say, the buyer profile has let me go back here for a second. If I go back here, this is addressing that 35%. The buyer profile addresses that 35%. There's something about that decision maybe an executive is making. And if that's a buyer profile. And when you're doing, if your buyer personas are at this level, you're missing out. You're missing out on this 65%. And that's the key. In order to connect and humanize your marketing, you've got to get to the 65% or greater of what executives are relying on in making their decision. So let's go back to something else we did. We had a poll question, which we said, somewhat effective to not effective at all, with the majority of the answers of your buyer persona. Well, this could be one of the main reasons why they're not effective, because they may be, your buyer personas, if you looked at them honestly, may be at this level, and you really can't connect too well at this level because it's common. It's a common objective way of looking at something versus going back over here where we've got executives that are sitting back in their chair thinking about things subjectively that are filled with emotions when they're making decisions. So how do we humanize them? Good question, right? What I hope to do here is to offer you some practical ways that you can begin to humanize. Now, I want to keep this in mind. I want to keep this in context for you, and that's it. We only have a few moments today, and there's a lot more that goes into explaining that. So at the end, if you need any further help, you can always contact me. But I do want to give you the contact that we have limited time today. But I will do my best to give you some pointers on how to humanize your marketing with the help of buyer personas. So, research the human story, not just intelligence. It's a very important concept. Oftentimes, if you're stuck on the intelligence, what are you doing? You're looking at data. You're talking to your salespeople. You're looking at industry reports. You might be doing win-loss interviews. Well, what's happening is you're missing the human story. And the way you get to the human story is this. You need to talk to customers and buyers directly, and you need to use some really sound qualitative research technique in order to have people describe their human story to you. And this is a very important concept. So obviously I've said a mouthful there. There's a lot of art and science that goes behind that. With our limited time today, it's hard to do all of that. But I want you to walk away with the idea here that you really need to focus in more on the human story and not just on the intelligence. And once you can do that through really sound qualitative buyer research, the world of the buyer is going to open up to you. You're going to make that connection to the human story. So this is a very, very important concept to keep in mind here. So if you find yourself doing redundant intelligence gathering that already exists in the organization, you should stop in your tracks and say, you know what, I'm not going in the right direction. I'm not uncovering the human story. Context matters. This is really important. You have, in the business-to-business world, in some cases even in business-to-consumer, we have this way of objectifying our products and services. And we talk about them in ways of them being an object, if you will. And what really is important today is to understand the contextual situation, the contextual environment, the contextual scenarios that people and buyers find themselves in today. And what that will do for you is give you a sense of, all right, what's the story that's going on with each one of these situations or scenarios or environment that they're involved in. So I like this picture. Imagine you're here at this location. The context behind this location means there's got to be a story behind every one of these. And for example, one story could be that, you know what, this could be a pretty dangerous job. If somebody's climbing that grid or climbing on top of that, and what does that mean to our product and service? let's use Jenna again as an example. You have Jenna Thomas. Let's say she's a senior director in finance operations. You know, she could actually have 3 different scenarios that are going on with her. She could have a situation where she's shorthanded and she's desperately trying to find talent that will prevent her team from being overworked, not missing deadlines. She also could be confronted with a situation where there are inventory outages happen in her organization that directly affect the financial health of the organization. So she could be involved in that kind of scenario. She also could be involved in a scenario where they're missing financial closing deadlines. And when you miss financial closing deadlines, they could be faced with penalties, for example. So here's Jenna, who's the Senior Director of Finance Operations. She could be involved in multiple scenarios. And I want to bring this concept up to you because it's extremely important. We often think about our product or our service in the sense of a journey and somebody just looking at that product. And in essence, when Jenna walks through the doors, she may have multiple scenarios going on. And when that happens, when somebody's in that kind of a situation, we need to ask ourselves, well, what is the human story behind each of these scenarios? What is going on? So for Jenna, when we look at finding talent as maybe the first scenario, she could be filled with emotion. There's a story behind that. You know, she cares about her team. She cares about her team being overworked. She cares about the fact that maybe if the reflection on her, if the work is not done right, if the quality work isn't done right. So there's a lot of things that go on. There's a story behind each one of these scenarios. So the concept of context matters. Is really important because there's a contextual thing that's going on in the world of Jenna. And that tells you then how you can get to the human story, if you can understand the context. So the third thing I want to just talk to you about is how to focus in on goal-centered emotions. And goal-centered emotions, again, people are acting and behaving based on their goals. And I had mentioned earlier that one confusion to avoid is where it's easy to slip the word goal in as a substitute for the word objective. Don't do that, because what you'll be missing out on is this, is that people exemplify goal-directed behavior that actually drive their decisions. And those goals could be around personal goals, they can be business goals, they can be experience goals. And they shape and influence how people make choices and how they make decisions. And I want to just point out to you, I have a cover of a book here that's called Goal-Directed Behavior. But there are multiple books, and there is a very in-depth body of work that's been done in the social sciences around how people make choices, how goals drive their choices, the powerful influences of goal-directed behavior. So this is the real core element of buyer personas, is to really understand what goal-directed behaviors are driving decisions. And I don't want to make it sound like this is something easy. It takes good, sound, qualitative research to get at it. It does mean that you will have to also change your own frame of reference of how you actually approach the idea of trying to understand your buyers today, but it's a very, very important concept. So, again, I'll just reiterate that goals is not a substitute for the word objective. It really, in this sense, means you're trying to understand the goal-directed behavior that drive decisions. Number 4, you want to seek to understand the unarticulated mindset. And what I mean by unarticulated, and this is where qualitative research is very helpful, people often have a hard time expressing what they truly feel and what they really are thinking about. And they come through when they describe their own human story. So when we take a look at this here, The unarticulated could involve things around their attitude, their perception, their previous learning, and the aggregate of these really represent a person's view of how the world works, and it influences their decisions. So how the world works between, let's say, an engineer and, let's say, a lawyer, their view of how the world works can be completely different. Yet, if we try to speak to both of those parties in the same way, we're going to miscommunicate and misconnect with both of them. So the importance of mental models is really an important part of buyer persona development. It's trying to understand the unarticulated mindset. How do we get a sense of how Jenna Thomas here, as a senior director of finance operations, how do we get a sense of what her view is of how the world works? And how does that influence her decision-making and the choices she makes? Okay, number 5. We want to focus in on the path to purchase, not on the generic buyer journey. Every few years, it's a word that pops up in business that takes on a life of its own. And I would say the buyer's journey is one of those words or phrases that have taken a life on its own and become a mythical word, if you will. What's happening with that is this. I think actually it sets people back if you just focus in on this generic buyer journey. Because you're trying to force fit what you think people are going through when they are going through a buying process. And I want you to keep in mind here, I talked about Jenna, who may have multiple scenarios, multiple contextual situations going on in her day in the life, which means that she's going to take a different path to a purchase depending on which scenario she's trying to address. So that's a very powerful concept, because once you understand the context, then you have a sense of how Jenna is attempting to address that particular contextual situation or scenario she finds herself in. And it may not be the same as the other scenarios that she's involved in. And typically what we're trying to do with a generic buyer journey is to force fit some generic way or generic understanding of how we think Jenna is going to buy something, which actually can be a way of setting you back, because then you lose the focus on the context and the situations that are involved in Jenna's world and how she goes about making choices, who she involves in those choices, what she begins to look at, what emotions and goals she's dealing with. And that's where the path of purchase can be a very powerful thing to look at. So what you want to do with your buyer persona is this. Is you really want to use buyer persona development as your listening practice to understand the human story of your buyers. One of the articles I just wrote this week, and you're more than welcome to go to my site later on and take a look at it, but it's the concept that marketing leaders today have to embrace story listening before storytelling. And we can't tell customers about a story unless we've really done the listening part, unless we've understood those particular goals, scenarios, attitudes, beliefs that actually influence their behavior, their choices, their decisions, and their interactions. And once we can really get involved in story listening, then we can do a good job of storytelling. And oftentimes, it's very easy to fall into the trap in marketing, we want to tell a story. There's no question about it. It's inherent in marketing probably since the dawn of marketing, that it's inherent that we want to tell a story. That's our job, to tell a story, to talk about our product, our service, our company. And the hardest thing to do for marketing is to step back and say, I've got to really allow time to do sound story listening. I really need to understand this human story that's going on in the world of our buyers today. Well beyond the rational and the logical and the criteria-filled, objectified way that we typically might look at a business or a buyer. I really do want to get into trying to understand the emotional side, the human level side. I really do want to know about those situations and how those stories within those situations unfold. And once I can do that, then I can put together a story that I know is going to mean something. It's going to really mean something to that person because I'm connecting with the story that I listen to, not the story that I've had in my head about telling. It's a story about what I listen to. So buyer persona development goes well beyond profiling and intelligence gathering. Buyer persona development is a human-centered approach intent on listening to the human story influencing how businesses and people make choices. So once you can do that, you are allowing an organization to be guided by human insight and to keep the human goals at the center of marketing. So the last thing I want to leave you with here is modern marketing today is connecting to the human story behind your product. We've really passed a significant era, if you will, and I call this era where it was basically product era, where we talked a lot about our product, and we talked a lot about features and benefits, and we extolled and praised our products. We are living now in a world where buyers are having multiple stories day in and day out unfolding. And what they care about is how can you be a part of that story? How can you really connect with them in a human way that allows you to be a part of their story? And we are at the very early stages of this. I can't predict what it's going to be like in 5 or 10 years, but my hunch tells me, based on multiple buyer interviews even this year, is that this will become increasingly more important. And also the buyers today will have little tolerance, if you will, for messaging or communications or marketing that really does not connect to their story. So I would really, really recommend beginning to understand what a human-centered approach is to marketing, because I have a hunch that in the next 5 to 10 years, without me calling it a prediction, but I think we'll see much more emphasis on human interaction, understanding stories, and I think that what people will be looking for is how well do you fit into their story that's going on. So I think before we end today, we wanted to have, at about 2:45, we wanted to have a few moments for questions. And then at the end, I can also give you a sense of where to get some resources, so forth and so on. So why don't we use this opportunity for the next 5 or 10 minutes to answer a question that people have. And I think if I'm using this ReadyTalk correctly, okay, I might see a couple questions or 3 questions.
Yep, absolutely, Tony. And if you want to go ahead and grab one of those and just read it out, that's fine. Or I can relay those to you as well.
Okay. Well, let me see. Here we go. Let's see if I doing this correctly and step in if I'm not. But I see a question here from Justin. Who in a large organization is responsible for putting together buyer personas? Product marketing, product management, etc. Very good question, Justin. Let me answer that as best as I can in the short time frame that we have. The best way to answer that question is, first of all, I will say all of the above. Okay? Well, let me share with you why I say all of the above. Buyer personas in general is a communications platform for the entire organization to have a common view of customers and buyers. So the responsibility could be in product marketing, but then if it is in product marketing, then they have to accept the responsibility that this common view of customers is then shared with the rest of the organization. In product management, we typically see more of an emphasis on user personas, because what we're looking for is goal-directed usage behavior of a product or service. So there is an important distinction there. In my own work in the last dozen years or so, I have seen product marketing take on the responsibility and then take on the responsibility of sharing this common view with the rest of the organization and getting input. I have seen corporate strategy take on the responsibility of doing the research and coming up with buyer personas and then sharing this common view. I have seen marketing strategy, marketing communication take on the responsibility. And what may surprise you is I've actually seen several wonderful, excellent examples of sales organizations who have taken on the responsibility as well. So it's a tough question to answer definitively. I think the more important concept is this. Whoever takes on the responsibility must also take on the responsibility and accountability to share this common view with the rest of the organization, and then make sure that the rest of the organization also has input. They also have seen a knowledge increase about this common view of the customer. So I hope that helps answer that particular question there, Justin. Let's see. Now we have another question that I see is from Joshua. It is safe to assume you should only consider those scenarios or contexts that directly impact or are impacted by product or service you're trying to market. I would say in general that's a safe assumption. What you're trying to do there, but I also will keep this in mind. I like that you use the word scenarios or context, because in the plural sense, because for your product or service, always keep in mind that there may be more than one. And sometimes they bump up against other things that don't have anything to do with your product or service, but you know that that their situation can touch them. But I think the biggest thing here, Joshua, is to, and I like the way you did that, is that those scenarios or contexts in the plural sense, is to look out for more than just one, and how your product or services can address more than one, and how they correlate or how they interact together. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, let's see, we have a question here. Can you provide examples of what people who are doing this well? There are several organizations that I think are doing this really well. You have GE as an example. I've done a lot of work with Thomson Reuters this year. They've been actually doing a wonderful job of humanizing the world of tax and accounting. If you can, the tax and accounting could be a very dry and very objectified kind of world, and they've been able to do a fantastic job about understanding the human story in that world and what people really care about and what their emotions are. And they've really come up with some great effort in marketing to really tap into the emotional part of what people experience during tax seasons and wanting to be leaders and how to utilize the latest technology. So those are a couple good examples right there. All right, let's see. We have a question, a framework of which to capture the human story. The framework essentially of capturing really is in the world of qualitative research. And so the framework is just there to use several types of techniques in qualitative research. And I just want to make a point that do not confuse win-loss interviews as a qualitative research method or a label. Some are now not calling them, but it's still win-loss interviews in my mind when that happens. What you really want, a good framework is around qualitative research usually involves in-depth interviews. It involves what's called contextual inquiry. So you're really kind of spending a lot of time in context and trying to understand the story. You're also dealing a lot in the world of field observation. We tend not to think of field observation in the business world, but it's a very important component. Particularly in trying to understand how a environment affects people, and how they influence choices. So these are the types of frameworks, if you will, those are the types of tools and techniques that you can use. All right, we have a question here from Lisa about how can you humanize a story with only interviewing a few buyers? Good question, Lisa. Qualitative research differs greatly from quantitative research, and one of those things that you'll find different is the quantity of the number of interviews. Well, the aim and the goal is different. With the quantitative approach, the sample size means something. You're trying to get the how many question answered, how many questions. In the world of qualitative research, you are looking for patterns. You are looking for commonalities and similarities about behaviors. And so in a world of quantitative where you might have a sample size of 1,000 or 2,000, you will get the how many. But in the world of qualitative research, when you can have sample sizes of a dozen to, let's say, as high as 50, what we're really trying to do there is you're really focusing in on what's the common behavioral pattern that you're uncovering. And that's why there's a difference there, and that's how you can uncover the human story, because you will find that there will be common behavioral patterns that will show up, let's say, in 20 or 25 or 30 types of interviews. All righty. How do you go about initiating a conversation to talk to customers about this? Well, this is kind of a little bit of a training question, but in general, what I'll ask you to do is this. When you think about it, when you talk to a family member or you talk to a friend over coffee or associate, is to get them to really just talk about their story and what's going on and how they feel. And that's the kind of approach. You really want to have an unstructured approach to this conversation. You don't want to really beat up anybody with a list of 15 and 20 questions and make them feel like they're being interrogated. You really want to get them to open up. And sort of a whole slew of qualitative research techniques around open-ended questions and contextual-based approaches that really help. Let's see. Our marketing message is always targeted by our personas and not a user persona. Wow, that's a great question, Mohar. That's a great question. Well, here's something I wrote about earlier. The influence of users today is becoming much more prominent. So if you ignore the user in your marketing messages, sometimes it could be at a great expense. Let me give you an example. If you have a large customer service department, users can be pretty powerful in being in looking for tools that help them to do their job more efficiently, quicker, or they recognize because they're on the front line what customers want. So they have a very powerful influence, and this actually came out of a buyer persona development study. And so look for that. Look for where the users are actually having a lot of input in their environment, and make sure that you do have messages for your user personas. Can your technique be, absolutely, let me read that again. Can your technique be applied to the development of user personas as well? Absolutely, absolutely. If the user personas are, have their grounding and their origins in human-centered design and user-centered design, so absolutely. We have a suite of technical products, thoughts on pulling emotions into our marketing. The only way I could tell you this is that behind every product or service, I don't care how complex, how complicated it is, there's a story behind it. And what you need to do is uncover that story. GE, I wrote an article on how GE makes the human connection. Go find it, because Beth Comstock did a great job in talking about how despite the complicated, highly complex product GE has, they are really tapping into human emotion. Let's see. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to have to pick a few here. Let's see. There's a few questions around qualitative interviewing. Rather than providing examples, because each situation could be different, what I will just emphasize is the importance of having an open-ended, unstructured way of allowing somebody to tell their story. And it's a qualitative research technique that you're being attentive, you're looking for trails almost, like an investigator, that you can explore more about what a person is telling, what the story that they're telling you about and what it means to them. So that's the best advice I can give, in the limited time that we have. And let's see, we're at 2:59, and I'm going to move on real quickly here because I know we only have till 3 o'clock, and if there's more time, I can go back to some of the questions that I missed. But I do want you to realize or to be aware of the fact that I'm in the middle of writing a book right now called A Guide to Buyer Persona Development. So you'll see an address down there, a web address. Please go to that address and sign up to receive updates about this book. And I'm also working on another project about how to humanize your brand. So if you go to my site, you'll be able to do the same thing for both books, be able to sign up to receive updates on those. If you need help, please come to my site. I offer a free 30-minute conversation for people who need help. There's an easy way to take a look at that and sign up for that. And then there's contact information as well. So that's the last tidbit. We are right at 3 o'clock, Sarah and Stacy. So I'm going to pass the baton, at least at this point, to you.
All right.
It's been an absolute pleasure, by the way, to have this opportunity to converse with all of you online today.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Tony. It was very, very interesting and enlightening. I have long appreciated your work. So thanks for being with us today. If you have any other follow-up questions for Pragmatic, you can contact us at the information on the screen. And I just wanted to tell you all thank you for attending. We've been really getting some momentum going with doing these webinars every month. Next month, we're organizing the Pragmatic Live series on the practical side of portfolio management. I encourage you to join us. That webinar will be with Mike Smart and Niles Davis from Egress Solutions. So thanks for being with us today, and thank all of you for joining us for the Pragmatic Live webinar series. You have a great day.